Welcome to Public Affairs. Berkowitz is my name. Politics is our game, and the name of our guest is State Senator Barack Obama, State Senator from the South Side of Chicago, Democrat Chicago, 13th Legislative District, right?
That's correct.
And tonight's show, we're going to talk about racial profiling. We're going to talk about some legislation that the senator is sponsoring, along with Monique Davis, right? State Representative.
Right. She's been active on this on the House level as well.
Okay, and we'll talk about, I think we'll talk more generally about the issue of race, which obviously racial profiling and any legislation related thereto would certainly deal with the issue of race. We'll talk about education and perhaps other issues, time permitting, and we'll get into a more formal introduction during the show of our guest. But I want to say this show is being taped on March 15th, and we'll show in a variety of venues at a variety of times. Let me start before we talk a little bit about the legislation that Senator Obama is proposing, or at least is sponsoring. Let's take a look at something that was written by John Derbyshire in the National Review, I guess online. Maybe he wrote it elsewhere, but I saw it National Review online. And he talks about, let me quote from the article, in Kansas City, a drug enforcement official stops and questions a young man who has just stepped off a flight from Los Angeles. The officer has focused on this man because intelligence reports indicate that black gangs in LA, Los Angeles, are flooding the Kansas City area with illegal drugs. Young, toughly dressed, whatever that means, and appearing nervous, he paid for his ticket in cash, checked no luggage, brought 2 carry-on bags, and made a beeline for a taxi when he arrived. And the article says, one other thing, the young man is black. When asked why he decided to question this man, the officer declares that he considered race, along with other factors, because doing so helps him allocate limited time and resources efficiently. Should we applaud the officer's conduct, the article asks? Should we permit it? Should we prohibit it? And the article goes on to say this is not a hypothetical example. Encounters like this take place every day all over the country as police battle street crime, drug trafficking, and illegal immigration. And this particular case study, the article says, happens to be the real-life scenario presented in a federal lawsuit of the early 90s. Want to take a stab on identifying the lawsuit?
Not the name of it.
Okay, but it sounds familiar.
It does sound familiar.
United States v. United States v. Weaver, in which the 8th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the constitutionality of the officer's action. You've got legislation that deals with racial profiling, perhaps in a different context, but one wonders if it's all tied up together. Tell our viewers a little bit, if you will, Senator Obama, of what your legislation is, what it's attempting to address, and maybe a little bit of what you think the likelihood is that it'll actually go through the legislature, the General Assembly.
Well, I think we have to step back and take a look at the context of the whole debate surrounding racial profiling in this country, a debate that's gone national and was a prominent aspect of the presidential campaign, the confirmation hearings of the U.S. Attorney General. We've now got the President and John Ashcroft both saying that racial profiling is a real problem that has to be dealt with. And I think the starting point is a recognition that race is a defining issue in American life, that it's something that is deeply embedded in our history. Much of it is tragic. And so each of us carry around a set of preconceptions about people who are different from us, and that those operate in daily life all the time. And in some ways, we can't entirely prevent them, but we can certainly observe them, and where we find ourselves making assumptions about people who are different from us that are based primarily on stereotypes, are not based on individual characteristics of the person that we're interacting with, then there's a great danger there. There's an even greater danger when the government, the arm of the state, starts engaging in those sorts of practices. Because what we can assume is that the assumptions or stereotypes that they're functioning under may not be entirely accurate. And even if statistically there is some accuracy to them, they may not be accurate for the particular individual who's being impacted by the heavy arm of the state. So let's go to the scenario that you discussed here. I would actually say that in that situation, that is not necessarily racial profiling. And the reason is because the law enforcement officer in that context was naming a whole variety of characteristics that rendered the individual suspicious. My hope would be that if a white individual was paying cash for an airplane ticket, had the same demeanor, seemed to be nervous, was engaging in the same sorts of suspicious behavior that would be indicative of possible criminal activity, that the law enforcement officer would also address that individual. And if there are other aspects of the behavior of an individual that are also suspicious, then the fact that that person is black or white or brown is not necessarily particularly relevant, and I think that is legitimate law enforcement practice. Now, just before, because I know you want to get to some questions, what do I consider racial profiling? The definition that I would use would be a situation where a person is stopped or searched or in some other fashion detained by law enforcement solely as a consequence of that person's race. And I think that for those of us who aren't aware of the degree to which this happens, let me just give you one concrete example that took place here in Chicago. And some of your viewers may be familiar with it. At O'Hare Airport, it was customary for a significant period of time, and now this has been settled by a consent decree, and there have been tremendous improvements, but black women were disproportionately searched whenever they were coming from overseas. They were searched at a rate 5 or 6 or 8 times the rate that white women were searched. They were searched to a greater degree than black men were searched, certainly to a greater degree than white men were searched. Now, what was the basis for this? Well, it turns out that there really wasn't any basis for it, because statistically, when you searched black women, it turned out that they were the least likely to be carrying drugs from overseas of any of the other groups that we're talking about. White men, black men, white women. And yet they were, by a significant margin, the ones most likely to be searched. Now, in that situation, what you have to suspect is going on is that somehow a stereotype or an assumption based solely on race has introduced itself into the system. And the objective, I think, of any racial profiling legislation should be to make us aware that those stereotypes or assumptions are operating, and where they are operating, that then gives us the possibility of rooting them out.
But, well, then, let me ask then, if in fact the data that you gave were different for O'Hare Airport, and let's just say hypothetically, which apparently is not the case, that say black women were disproportionately more likely to bring in, say, drugs through the airport, and say you had good reason to believe that that was an accurate statistic, it wasn't a stereotype that was based on erroneous information, would your view be that that aspect of that trait, along with other traits, would be a reasonable approach to law enforcement?
I think I would still be troubled to the extent that race predominated over the other traits that you discuss as the basis for making the search. And the reason for it is this. Let's go to a more standard example that people are probably familiar with. Young black male is driving through Winnetka. what's the population of Winnetka that's black? Well, it's probably a
Pretty
relatively
small.
small number. One could say that statistically, that person is incongruous. There's a sense that maybe that person doesn't belong, and as a consequence, a police officer feels justified stopping that person, not because he's black, but because he stands out. Well, from my perspective at least, sort of a baseline of our social compact is that each of us are supposed to be treated as individuals, and we don't want the government to be making statistical assumptions about us. We were talking before the program started about the fact that by far the most violent cohort of our population are young men, let's say between the ages of 16 and 25. Now, we could make decisions, for example, that young men simply can't drive, or we could make decisions that they can never buy alcohol, or we could make decisions that anytime we see them driving, a police officer is justified in making a stop, because it's much more likely that a young male in that cohort is going to be committing a crime. But we don't do that, and the reason we don't do that is because the proportion of any population that is engaged in criminal activity is extraordinarily small. And so we say to ourselves, as a value judgment, as a society, we say, it's not worth it for us to search 10 young men simply to catch the one that might be engaging in criminal activity, even if the incidence is 1 in 10, whereas the incident among young women is 1 in 30. We still don't say that it's acceptable to search those young men. Well, the same thing is true with African Americans or Hispanics. If you have a situation that African Americans or Hispanics, because of poverty or life circumstances, are more likely to be caught up in the criminal justice system, we're still talking about a very small number. And for the 9 out of 10 African Americans or Latinos who aren't engaging in criminal activity, we as a society can't find it acceptable to say that we're going to harass or bother or stop those people simply because statistically we may be more likely to catch a criminal by stopping all of those people.
Well, I'm confused a little bit because I thought you said earlier in the conversation,
Right.
It sounded to me as if you were saying race along with other traits that make the person suspicious might be permissible and might not fit within your defenation of racial profiling. Did I get that wrong?
I would argue that the only time where I think race is a permissible criteria would be a situation where we know, for example, that we're looking for a suspect whose description includes race. I think that there's nothing objectionable to, let's say, there is a search taking place for a criminal, a violent criminal who is identified as African American, 6'4", 230 pounds, for the police to focus on African Americans who are 6'4" and 230 pounds. On the other hand, when you see police stopping African Americans who are 5'6" and 130 pounds, but are African American, then you have a potential problem.
Let me give you
in terms of
one other
racial
example,
profile.
and then we'll go on to your legislation, so I want to get to that. But this is a quote in that same article, I believe, from John Derbyshire. And I think he's quoting Bernard Parks, chief of the Los Angeles Police Department. I think this goes back. I don't know if he's still chief, but I think this is 1999. So not that far back. And he quotes the police chief as saying, "We have an issue of violent crime against jewelry salespeople. The predominant suspects," I don't think he means as to a specific crime, but in that generic area of crime, "are Colombians. We don't find Mexican Americans or blacks or other immigrants. It's a collection of several hundred Colombians who seem to commit this crime. You see 6 in a car in front of the jewelry mart, and they're waiting, and they're watching people with briefcases. Should we play the percentages and follow them?" He says it's common sense.
I have no problem with that.
Okay.
But here's, again, the distinction would be that you have some identifiable behavior, right, that is being observed that justifies a law enforcement intervention. Right? Now, if, on the other hand, the police officer is saying, you know what, anytime a Colombian passes by a jewelry store, right, we're going to stop them to see whether they're potentially casing the joint, then you've got a problem.
Okay, and it goes on to say, the article says, cops like Parks say that racial profiling is a sensible, statistically based tool. Profiling lowers the cost of obtaining and processing crime information, which in turn lowers the overall cost of doing the business of policing. And the fact that a number of cops who support racial profiling, like I think Bernard Parks is black, and he says a number of cops who support that are black, buttresses claims that the practice isn't motivated by bigotry, at least sometimes. He doesn't say that, that's my word.
Well, but
is that, I mean, and so it seems like...
But I think, number one, I think your qualifier is important. You're saying sometimes. Right. Well, you know, one of our questions then
seems
is
like an obvious one. I don't know how somebody...
Well, I would hope that he would adopt that same qualifier. Right? Now, part of the issue would be to make sure that as a society we might say that any incidents where it's inappropriate to engage in this sort of racial profiling is deeply disturbing, and we need to deal with it. And there are going to be situations where typically police or any law enforcement official might want to take shortcuts like we all do in all our professions. Right? I mean, I'm a lawyer. I might want to take certain shortcuts in terms of how I engage in my practice. It's understandable that I think law enforcement officials who, first of all, the vast majority of them I think do an excellent job and are not racially biased in terms of how they administer the law. But there may be a certain percentage that says, you know what, it is easier for me to engage in assumptions about, based on race, for me to do my job. And my suggestion would be that effective police work is in fact enhanced when you are using a range of criteria for why you're doing things, and that you're focusing on criminal behavior and identifiable criteria as opposed to basing judgments on race.
Well, tell us a little bit about, we could go on this
Sure.
indefinitely, but tell us a little bit about your legislation and why you think it would be effective.
Well, I think this is common sense legislation that's already been adopted in a number of states. Our sister state, just the south of us, Missouri, adopted it. Just recently, a number of major cities like San Diego have adopted it. And all it does is it basically says, let's start collecting some data in terms of, and the primary focus of my legislation is addressing the issue of traffic stops. And what we say is simply, let's identify who's being stopped, who's being subjected to searches, in what areas is that occurring, with what officers is that occurring. And there's a twofold rationale for data collection being important. One is it's a useful management tool for police departments to see if there are any problems that need to be addressed. That's number one. And those problems may be there's one or two police officers in a particular department that are engaging in inappropriate behavior, which is shooting up the statistics in terms of why it is that blacks or Hispanics are disproportionately stopped. The second important reason is I think that it also lifts the cloud from those departments and police officers who are doing an excellent job. I have to say that what strikes me when I walk into a room of African American or Hispanic males, and the conversation comes up in terms of being stopped by police, that 100% of them will have some story about being stopped in a situation where they suspect that they were stopped solely on the basis of race. Now, let's discount half of those as people who were, they were speeding, got caught, and are disgruntled about it. And let's assume that another fourth of them were people who maybe genuinely felt they were being targeted as a consequence of race, but in fact were not. It was a misunderstanding or what have you. And that still leaves a pretty sizable bunch of folks who are extraordinarily credible in their presentations. I mean, I have stories of, from federal judges who get stopped, are shown identifications as being federal district court judges, are detained while the police goes back, makes phone calls, checks their license plates. These aren't sort of the types of folks who, upon observation, you would say to yourself are likely to be committing crimes. So, A, there's a real problem, but B, I don't want to overstate it. I think that there's a tendency maybe to overstate the problem and, as a consequence, to cast a pall on those law enforcement officials who are doing a good job. That's why we need to just collect some data in this state to see if we can figure out the degree of the problem and where it's occurring.
But by saying every stop, there's going to be a standard card,
Yeah.
and if there's a citation issued, that goes in one pile. If there's a warning issued, it goes in another pile.
Right.
If there's a stop and nothing's issued, it goes in another pile.
Right.
The facts relating to that incident are recorded, but the race in each case goes down. Right. And I'm just wondering, is it supposed to always be clear to the policeman stopping the person what the race is?
No.
And if not, does that person ask the person?
Well, no. One of the things that we're trying to identify here is what are the perceptions of the police. I mean, we're not doing census taking here. So the idea is not that we have to have an absolutely accurate assessment of who was being stopped.
But that having been said, then I understand the legislation goes on to say that all this information goes to the county clerks, the county clerks of the county courts, of which there are over 100, I guess, in the state of Illinois.
Actually, the part of what we're hoping to do is that the information goes to the Secretary of State's office.
Ultimately, but as I read the legislation, it sounded like the clerks are responsible for forwarding it on, collecting it. It goes to the Secretary of State, and then the legislation reads to the Secretary of State does a study, a report, an analysis, and determines if there's a pattern of discrimination throughout the state, and then sends the findings to what we affectionately call the four tops. That is the majority leader, the majority leader of each house.
Right.
The minority leaders.
Effectively, they'd be presenting it to the General Assembly. But keep in mind, one thing that I don't want to get too hung up on is the details of the mechanics of, where the reports are being funneled to, how the reports are being prepared.
But my point is that a pattern of discrimination. What is that? Are we inevitably facing the issue of quotas? People say once you're doing this and you're a cop on the beat.
Wait. Now hold on. Well, no.
We only got 4 or 5 minutes, so I want to get to this topic.
But I'm going to stop you there, Jeff, because I think that whenever you throw around the word quotas, right, it's a red flag, and there's nothing related here to quotas whatsoever. All we're saying is that let's observe the data. And one of the things that's happened, and I've been very heartened by, is that over the last several weeks, I had the opportunity to speak to the Illinois Police Chiefs Association about a month ago, and had a good, frank conversation, and I give them a tremendous amount of credit. They initiated an entire weekend training program for all their police chiefs across the state to discuss this problem, and they invited me to speak in part on this legislation. What's emerged is that I'm hoping that we're, over the next several weeks, going to be entering into negotiations and conversation with the Illinois State Chiefs of Police, as well as hopefully Attorney General Jim Ryan, and that we can emerge with a consensus bill that ensures that the data that's being used is not used as a political football, is not manipulated for soundbite purposes, but rather is something that is going to actually provide us with some accurate information that can ultimately make law enforcement more effective than it is right now in the state of Illinois.
Well, I didn't want to soundbite things out or throw things out.
No.
We're going to continue to speak as the credits roll. We are going to come to the end of the show in a few minutes. But one, I promised our viewers an introduction, so I want to give that. Sure. It comes at an awkward moment, but let me just tell them that Senator Obama has got his undergraduate degree at Columbia University, became a community organizer in both Harlem and the south side of Chicago for 5 years, and then Harvard Law School, cum laude graduate, and first African-American president of Harvard Law Review. Last 7 years and currently of counsel with the Loop law firm of Minor, Barnhill, and Gowan, right?
Yep, that's correct.
And specializes in voting and employment rights cases. Last 4 years and currently senior lecturer at the University of Chicago Law School, teaches common law and voting rights.
Yep.
Certainly a timely topic.
It is. Been having a good conversation. I will say that the election was a boon for lawyers and law professors. They had a good time talking about these issues.
Okay. Last 4 years and currently state senator, that you've done a lot, I know, on juvenile justice, a lot on welfare reform. Senator Obama lives, in the south side of Chicago?
South side of Chicago.
In Hyde Park?
In Hyde Park.
In Hyde Park.
Right.
With his wife Michelle and young daughter, and I understand you're expecting.
We've got
two of you
another
are
one.
expecting a second in June?
We've got another one on the way, so I'm trying to store up on my sleep now.
And of course, Senator Obama ran in a tough race in the first congressional district in the Democratic primary against Bobby Rush, and most people agree put up a very good contest. All that having been said, and thanks, my thanks truly to Senator Obama for coming up and sharing his views with our viewers across the city of Chicago and in 34 suburbs. And the troublesome part, I didn't mean to throw out quotas as, oh, this is terrible. It sounds, you want to gather information, oh, that sounds like a good thing, because assuming it's not too costly, most people think more information is better than less, and we can look at it and, as you say, pick up some things that we might not otherwise know and then begin to address them. People worry, as the cop on the beat, because you're judging this. As you say, people are now looking at who did you stop, what was their race, how are you reporting it. If you stop 2 people of a certain minority in one area and you see you get a third, even though peculiar statistical occurrence and yet it happens, do you start judging whether you should whether you should stop somebody?
Two responses to that very quickly, because I know we're running out of time. One is, I think police officers take their jobs extremely seriously. If they've got probable cause based on reasonable suspicion that potential criminal activity is taking place, I think they're going to go ahead and make that stop. I don't think they're going to censor themselves in that fashion or determine, well, you know what, I just stopped one black guy, I can't stop another black guy because it's going to look bad in terms of my numbers. I think they're going to address the issue of potential crime taking place. Number 2, though, I don't think that there's anything wrong, and in fact, I think one of the positive things about this legislation is to put a little voice in the backs of the minds of every law enforcement officer, which is carrying the full power of the state behind them, or law enforcement officer, to say to themselves, now, let me just think for a moment, am I suspicious about somebody solely because they look different than I do? Or I don't think that that kind of person should be in a particular neighborhood. Having that commentary in their heads, I think, will in fact ultimately make them more effective as police officers.
But you're agreeing that race can be one factor among several or many, depending on the circumstances, that the state uses in terms of the agents of the state use in terms of making a stop.
What I would say would be that I think that there are a set of extraordinarily narrow circumstances in which race might be a relevant criteria, and that primarily revolves around you actively pursuing a particular suspect or set of suspects, or working with a particular description. I would not concede that there are situations that are appropriate whereby we know statistically that African Americans are more likely